It isn't coincidence. That is the first thing worth saying clearly, because the pattern is too consistent, too specific, too recognizable across too many different lives and too many different circumstances to be explained by bad luck or poor judgment or the random distribution of who ends up with whom. If you have identified yourself as someone with a deep capacity for emotional attunement, someone who feels other people's interiors with a sensitivity that sometimes feels more like a burden than a gift, and you keep finding yourself drawn into relationships with people who are defended, distant, and emotionally unavailable in ways that cost you enormously, the consistency of that pattern is not an accident. It is the expression of a psychological logic that is worth understanding clearly, not because understanding it automatically changes it, but because the pattern that is seen accurately can be worked with in a way that the pattern attributed to bad luck or personal failing never can be. You are not unlucky. You are not broken. You are not someone who attracts the wrong people, because something fundamental about you calls in what is bad for you. You are someone whose specific psychological profile creates a specific gravitational field, and that field, for reasons that are genuinely comprehensible once the underlying psychology is laid out, draws avoidance with a consistency that has nothing to do with accident and everything to do with a precise, complementary fit between two very specific kinds of interior architecture. Begin with what the super impact actually is, at the level of genuine psychological substance, rather than the flattened, sometimes romanticized version that gets used carelessly. The super empath is not simply a highly sensitive person, not simply someone who is kind or caring or good at listening. Those qualities are present, but they are surface expressions of something more structurally significant. The super empath is someone whose nervous system developed, typically through early experience, an extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional states of other people, not as a personality preference. As a survival adaptation, the child who grew up in an environment where attunement to the emotional states of caregivers was functionally necessary, where reading the room accurately was the difference between safety and threat, between receiving care and being overlooked, between the household being calm and the household erupting. That child develops a neurological sensitivity that most people simply don't have, an ability to register microexpressions, tonal shifts, the specific quality of silence that means one thing versus the specific quality of silence that means another, an ability to feel what is happening in the emotional interior of people around them before those people have expressed it, and sometimes before those people have consciously registered it themselves. This is not a gift in the uncomplicated sense. It is an adaptation that was expensive to develop and that continues to be expensive to carry, because the sensitivity that was developed to navigate a specific early environment continues operating in all subsequent environments, regardless of whether the co-environment requires the same level of vigilance. The super empath walks into ordinary social situations with neurological equipment calibrated for much higher stakes. They feel more, register more, are affected by more, and they often spend a significant portion of their relational life trying to find situations that are worthy of the depth of their sensitivity, that justify and can receive the full force of their capacity for genuine emotional attunement. Now consider the avoidant, whose early environment produced a different but equally significant adaptation. The child who learned that emotional expression was met with dismissal or overwhelm or the withdrawal of care. That child's nervous system drew the opposite conclusion from the super empaths, where the super empath system learned to reach outward, to attune, to sense and respond to the emotional interior of others as the primary navigational tool for safety. The avoidance system learned to reach inward, to contain, to suppress, to manage the emotional interior carefully rather than express it, because expression was the thing that had proven most costly in the original environment. Two children, two different environments, two different adaptations, and two adults who are in the most specific and consequential sense, neurologically shaped to find each other extraordinarily compelling. The compellingness runs in both directions but for different reasons, and understanding each direction is what makes the full picture visible. From the super empath side, the avoidant is compelling for a reason that is both completely understandable and worth examining honestly. The avoidant presents as a puzzle, not deliberately, not as a strategy, not as a manipulation, but as the authentic expression of someone whose interior is genuine and rich and specifically not on the surface. The avoidant's defended exterior, their self-sufficiency, their particular quality of warmth that appears and then retreats. All of this registers to the super empath's finely calibrated nervous system, not as a red flag, but as a signal. The signal that says, there is more here than what is visible. There is an interior that is not being expressed. There is a person underneath the presentation whose actual emotional life is significantly deeper than the distance they maintain would suggest. The super empath is right about this. That is what makes the pull so powerful and so difficult to simply dismiss as bad judgment. The avoidant does have an interior that is deeper than the distance suggests. The warmth that breaks through the defense is genuine. The moments of real connection that emerge when the architecture briefly steps back are real. The super empath's perception of significance beneath the surface is accurate perception. It is not projection. It is the specific, finely tuned, developmentally honed attunement, working as designed and reading something that is genuinely there. What the perception doesn't automatically include is the full picture of the cost. The accurate reading of the avoidance depth is real, but the accurate reading of the avoidance current capacity to allow that depth to be consistently present in a relationship, that is the part that the initial attraction tends to outpace. The super empath senses what could be and extends toward it with the full force of their considerable emotional capacity before the complete picture of what is and what the gap between what is and what could be will actually require of them is fully visible. From the avoidance side, the super empath is compelling for reasons that are equally comprehensible and equally worth examining. The super empath's attunement creates something that the avoidant has never previously encountered in quite this form. It creates the experience of being understood without having to explain, of being seen in the defended places without the scene feeling like an attack on those places, of having another person respond to what is actually present in the avoidance interior, the fear, the wound, the genuine feeling beneath the management, rather than to the managed presentation of it. For the avoidant whose entire relational life has been organized around the careful management of what is shown and what is concealed, the experience of being seen without the showing is simultaneously the most threatening and the most profoundly relieving thing available. The relief is genuine. The super empath's non-threatening attunement creates a quality of felt safety that the avoidance nervous system has never had adequate conditions to develop. And felt safety, however briefly and however tentatively experienced, is what the avoidance attachment system has always been oriented toward, without ever knowing how to reach. The avoidant is drawn to the super empath because the super empath is the first person whose specific quality of presence makes the avoidance interior feel, however fleetingly, safe to exist in the presence of another person. The super empath doesn't demand the vulnerability. They simply receive whatever is offered without making the receipt a transaction. And this non-transactional quality of receiving is to the avoidance nervous system the rarest possible thing. The thing the architecture was built to find and protect against simultaneously, because the wanting of it and the fear of it have always been running at the same intensity, in the same interior. The dynamic that develops from this mutual compelling is one of the most psychologically intricate available in the landscape of adult attachment, and it has a specific architecture that, once seen, explains the entire trajectory of how these relationships tend to move. The super empath extends, brings the full force of their attunement to the connection, creates, through the specific quality of their presence, the conditions under which the avoidance interior becomes more accessible than it has ever been in any previous relationship. The avoidant, encountering these conditions, begins to arrive. Begins tentatively and with many retreats to allow the genuine feeling to be present in a way the architecture has never previously permitted. This arrival is real. It is not performance. It is the avoidance genuine self responding to the genuine safety that the super empath's attunement provides. And the super empath, feeling the arrival, experiences what their attunement was always built for. The recognition of something real, the meeting of genuine depth with genuine depth, the specific, irreplaceable experience of their extraordinary sensitivity being not just exercised, but genuinely received, of being in the presence of someone who needs exactly what they have to offer, and whose interior, when it surfaces, is as rich and as real as the super empathy sensitivity had always told them it was. This is the honeymoon architecture of the super empath avoidant dynamic, and it is genuinely beautiful in the specific way that two people whose deepest capacities are in genuine, complementary exchange can be beautiful. It is also temporary, for reasons that are entirely predictable once the full psychology is understood. The avoidance arrival activates the architecture's threat response, the genuine feeling that is surfacing, the real, undefended, vulnerable feeling that the super empath's attunement created the conditions for, crosses the threshold that the nervous system has always treated as danger. The closeness becomes too close. The significance becomes too significant. The investment in another person's presence reaches the level at which losing that presence would genuinely hurt. And the nervous system, faithful to its original programming, responds to the genuine hurt risk with the full deployment of the deactivating strategies. The retreat comes, and the super empath, whose attunement felt the arrival so vividly, feels the retreat with the same vividness, feels it not as the ordinary cooling of early relationship intensity that most people might experience, feels it as the specific, detailed, almost physical withdrawal of something that was genuinely present and is now specifically absent. The super empath sensitivity, which was an asset in the approach phase, becomes a liability in the retreat phase because the depth of their sensitivity means they feel the retreat at full intensity, every degree of the withdrawal registering with an acuity that most people simply don't have access to. This is where the super empath's own early adaptation begins to work against them, because the same attunement that reads the avoidance depth accurately also reads the retreat's source accurately. The super empath knows, however uncomfortably, that the retreat is fear rather than indifference, knows, in the specific somatic precognitive way their sensitivity operates, that the warmth is still there beneath the cooling, that the genuine feeling didn't go anywhere, that the architecture is working against something real rather than revealing that there was nothing real to begin with. This accurate reading is the hook, not a manipulation, an accurate reading. The avoidance fear is genuinely covering something real. And the super empath, knowing this with the certainty of direct attunement rather than hopeful projection, finds themselves in the specific position that the dynamic most characteristically produces. The position of understanding the avoidant more clearly than the avoidant understands themselves, and extending patience and compassion toward a fear that is genuinely present, in service of a connection that is genuinely real, at a cost that keeps accumulating, without producing the sustained mutuality that the investment deserves. The super empath stays because they are right about what is underneath. This is the genuinely difficult truth at the center of the dynamic. The staying is not naivety. It is not codependency in the simple sense of someone who is addicted to unavailability. It is the reasoned, attuned, specifically accurate response of someone who genuinely perceives something worth staying for, and whose perception is not wrong. The problem is not the perception. The problem is the gap between what the super empath perceives in the avoidant and what the avoidant's current capacity allows them to consistently offer. The depth is real. The capacity to sustain access to the depth in the ongoing, reciprocal, mutually investing reality of a genuine relationship, that is where the gap lives. And the super empath, whose extraordinary sensitivity keeps the depth visible even when the architecture is working hardest to obscure it, can occupy that gap for a very long time before the cost of occupying it becomes undeniable. The longer view of this dynamic reveals something important about both people that the immediate experience of the attraction tends to obscure. The super empath and the avoidant are not simply compatible and incompatible simultaneously. They are, in a specific and significant sense, each other's most important developmental challenge. The avoidant needs, for genuine healing, exactly what the super empath offers: the non-threatening attunement, the patient, non-demanding presence that creates safety without requiring the safety to produce immediate transformation. The specific quality of being understood without having to explain that is the only environmental condition under which the avoidance nervous system can begin the gradual, evidence-based revision of its threat assessment. The super empath needs, for genuine healing, something that the dynamic with the avoidant consistently fails to provide and consistently demonstrates the absence of: genuine reciprocity, the experience of their extraordinary sensitivity being met with equivalent depth from the other direction, the specific sustaining reality of another person's attunement directed back at them with the same care and consistency that they direct outward. The super empath, whose early environment required them to develop extraordinary sensitivity to others' interiors, typically developed this sensitivity at some cost to the equal and opposite capacity: the capacity to require adequate attunement to their own interior, to hold the standard of genuine reciprocity without immediately reading the other person's limitations and extending compassion toward those limitations instead. The dynamic with the avoidant is, in this sense, the super empath's most consistent teacher about exactly this capacity. Every iteration of the dynamic, every experience of extending fully and receiving partially, of perceiving depth that cannot be consistently accessed, of accurately reading genuine feeling that remains trapped beneath architecture that was never fully dismantled, is the same lesson delivered with increasing clarity: the lesson that accurate perception of another person's interior richness is not sufficient grounds for indefinitely sustaining an asymmetric investment. That compassion for another person's fear is not the same as the requirement to absorb the cost of that fear indefinitely. That the super empath's capacity for attunement, however extraordinary, deserves an object that is capable of genuine reciprocity, rather than simply an object that is genuinely deep. The attraction between super empaths and avoidants is finally the attraction between two people who are each the most vivid possible mirror for what the other most needs to develop. The avoidant needs to develop the capacity to remain present to genuine intimacy without the architecture making the retreat decision on their behalf. The super empath needs to develop the capacity to require genuine reciprocity without the attunement's accurate reading of the other person's depth, substituting for the experience of actually receiving it. Neither development is available without the challenge. The avoidant cannot develop the capacity for sustained intimacy without encountering someone whose presence makes the intimacy feel genuinely possible. Without the super empath, the super empath cannot develop the capacity for genuine reciprocity as a non-negotiable requirement without repeatedly experiencing with vivid clarity what the absence of genuine reciprocity actually costs. Without the avoidant, the dynamic is painful. It is genuinely, specifically, often profoundly costly in ways that deserve acknowledgement rather than minimization. But it is not random. It is not bad luck. It is the specific, psychologically coherent meeting of two people whose histories produce the precise complementary adaptations that make each the most compelling and most instructive relational experience available to the other. What the super empath does with that instruction, whether the repeated experience of the dynamic produces the development of genuine reciprocity as a requirement rather than a hope, or whether the attunement continues to extend beyond what is being returned, is the question that determines everything about what comes next. Not just in relation to the avoidant, in relation to every significant connection that follows. The pattern exists for a reason. The reason is comprehensible, and comprehensible patterns, unlike random bad luck, are the kind that can actually be worked with, that can be understood well enough to be, if not broken, then at least engaged with the eyes open rather than the heart alone. Open eyes and open heart simultaneously, that is the development the dynamic is pointing toward, for both people, in their own ways, on their own timelines. That convergence, when it happens, when both people arrive at genuine capacity rather than one person perpetually bridging the gap toward the other's potential, is what the dynamic was always moving toward. Whether it arrives within this specific connection or in the ones that follow it is the question only time and genuine interior work can answer. But the movement toward it is real, and recognizing the pattern accurately is the first genuine step in that direction. The movement toward genuine development is not a straight line for either person. This is worth sitting with before going further, because the narrative that the dynamic produces, the narrative that the super empath is the developed one, and the avoidant is the one who needs to catch up, is a simplification that serves neither person's actual growth. Both people are in process. Both people have work to do that the other's presence is pointing toward, and the specific work each person needs to do is illuminated most clearly by examining what the dynamic actually costs them and what that cost is consistently asking them to look at. For the avoidant, the cost of the dynamic with the super empath is the most visible and has been examined at length across the full arc of this series. The avoidant loses the person most capable of reaching them, loses the specific irreplaceable quality of attunement that created the conditions for genuine self-contact, loses, through the faithful operation of the deactivating architecture, the thing the architecture was supposedly protecting them from meeting. The cost is obvious in retrospect and invisible in real time, which is the specific, cruel efficiency of the avoidance defensive system. For the super empath, the cost is different and deserves its own honest examination, because the super empath's losses in this dynamic are not just relational, they are developmental. Each iteration of the pattern in which the extraordinary attunement is extended towards someone who cannot consistently reciprocate it is an iteration in which the super empath's nervous system is reinforcing a specific learned association, the association between depth and asymmetry, between genuine connection and the experience of working harder than the other person to sustain it, between love and the specific labor of perceiving someone's interior richness, while that richness remains largely inaccessible to them. This association, reinforced across multiple iterations of the same dynamic, begins to function as a template. The super empath's nervous system, which learned in early experience to attune to others as a navigational tool, now has an additional layer of learning built on top of that original adaptation. It has learned the genuine depth, the specific quality of interior richness that the attunement finds most compelling, is located in defended people, in people whose warmth comes through a wall, in people whose genuine feeling is real but not directly accessible, in people who require the super empath's extraordinary capacity in order for the connection to function at the level of genuine exchange. The template is not a character flaw. It is a learned association that developed for comprehensible reasons and that can be examined and revised when it is understood clearly. But examined it must be, because the template is what keeps the pattern running, even when the super empath has done substantial internal work, even when they have developed significant self-awareness, even when they can articulate the dynamic with considerable sophistication. The articulation exists at the cognitive level. The template exists at the neurological level. And the neurological level is where the attraction is generated, below the cognitive processing, in the immediate, pre-reflective response to encountering someone whose specific profile activates the template's pattern recognition. The super empath, who meets someone whose warmth is complicated by defense, whose genuine feeling is real but difficult to access, whose interior is rich but guarded. That person registers in the super empath system as specifically compelling before any cognitive assessment has had time to engage. The pull is felt before it is thought, and the thought, arriving after the pull, is typically organized around the pull rather than around an independent assessment. It finds the reasons why the pull makes sense, why this specific person's depth is worth the specific cost of reaching it, why the attunement that has always found defended interiors most compelling is pointing towards something genuinely worth pointing toward. The reasons are not wrong. The depth is real. The worth is genuine. But the cognitive assessment that the pull generates in its own justification is not the same as the independent assessment of whether this specific dynamic with this specific person at this specific level of their development is compatible with the super empath's genuine well-being and genuine need for reciprocity. This is the development the dynamic is pointing toward for the super empath, not the suppression of the attunement. The attunement is genuinely extraordinary and genuinely valuable, and suppressing it would be the loss of one of the most significant capacities available in human relational experience. But the development of an additional capacity that the original adaptation did not include, the capacity for independent assessment that runs alongside the attunement rather than being generated by it. The distinction is specific and worth dwelling on. The attunement says, there is genuine depth here. There is real feeling beneath the defense. The interior is rich, and the person is genuinely worth knowing. All of this is accurate perception, and it is generated by the attunement operating correctly. The independent assessment says, given that all of this is true, given the genuine depth and the real feeling and the interior richness, what is this person's current capacity to allow that depth to be present in a sustained, reciprocal, consistently available way in the reality of an actual relationship? Not their potential capacity, not the capacity that the super empath's presence might eventually create conditions for. Their current, demonstrated, behaviorally evidenced capacity. The attunement reads potential. The independent assessment reads actuality. Both are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient. The super empath who operates from attunement alone keeps extending toward potential without adequately accounting for the actuality. The person who operates from independent assessment alone loses the ability to perceive the depth that the attunement makes visible. The development required is the integration of both, the full use of the extraordinary attunement to perceive what is genuinely present, alongside the honest, grounded, non-attunement generated assessment of what is currently available. What does this integration look like in practice? How does it actually change the super empath's experience of encountering the avoidance specific profile? It changes the timeline of the extension. The super empath with integrated attunement and independent assessment still feels the pull toward the defended interior, still recognizes the depth, still extends genuine warmth and genuine care. But the extension is time limited by evidence rather than by hope. The extension is offered genuinely and is simultaneously being assessed against the evidence of what is actually being offered in return. Not impatiently, the super empath's capacity for patience is genuine and valuable, but with the clear, honest, ongoing assessment of whether the patience is producing the gradual emergence of genuine reciprocity or the gradual accommodation of its absence. The difference between those two trajectories is visible in behavior over time. Genuine reciprocity emerging looks like the avoidance window of genuine engagement gradually widening, the retreats becoming slightly shorter, the arrivals going slightly deeper, the forward movement being imperfect but directional, moving toward more genuine presence rather than orbiting the same level of managed availability. These are the behavioral signs of genuine development, and they are worth waiting for because they represent real change rather than performed change. The accommodation of absence looks like something else entirely. It looks like the super empath's expectations gradually adjusting downward, rather than the avoidance capacity gradually developing upward, like the standard of reciprocity that the super empath began with being slowly revised to match what the avoidant is currently offering, rather than held steady as the measure against which the avoidance development is assessed. Like the super empath becoming, over time, more skilled at not needing the reciprocity rather than more effective at requiring it. This downward adjustment is perhaps the most costly developmental consequence of the repeated dynamic, because it is invisible from the inside and reads from within the experience like growth, like the development of patience, like the maturation of someone who has learned not to be needy. But it is not the development of genuine patience, it is the erosion of genuine standards. And the erosion of genuine standards is not a developmental achievement. It is the template being reinforced at the cost of the super empath's most fundamental relational need. There is something else the dynamic consistently produces in the super empath that deserves honest attention. It produces a specific relationship with the experience of being known, because the super empath, whose extraordinary capacity for knowing others is the defining feature of their relational experience, is frequently in the position of knowing more about the avoidant's interior than the avoidant knows about theirs. The attunement flows outward with extraordinary force and consistency. What flows back is partial, inconsistent, complicated by the architecture's management of what the avoidant is able to express. The super empath who has spent significant time in this dynamic can develop, without necessarily realizing it, a kind of relational self-effacement, a habit of being more interested in the other person's interior than in advocating for genuine curiosity about their own, a tendency to find the other person's defended complexity more compelling than the experience of being uncomplicatedly known themselves, a subtle but significant orientation toward the experience of knowing as the primary relational reward, with being known as a secondary and often deferred experience. This is not a flaw. It is the template operating in the relational domain. The child who learned to attune to others as a navigational tool for safety often learns simultaneously to make their own interior less visible, less demanding, less central to the relational exchange. The super empath's sensitivity was developed partly in service of the other people in the original environment. Their own interior was, often, the thing that had to be managed or contained or subordinated in order for the attunement to others to function as it needed to function. The developmental work this points toward is the recovery of genuine interest in being known, the development of the specific, non-performance, non-demand version of requiring genuine curiosity about one's own interior from the people who claim to be in genuine connection with you, not as a transactional requirement, you attune to me and I'll attune to you, but as the basic, non-negotiable reality that genuine connection is bilateral, that the super empath's interior is as worth knowing as anyone else's, and that the relationship in which the super empath's depth is consistently less visible and less attended to than the other person's depth is not the equal partnership that their extraordinary capacity deserves. The super empath who arrives at this understanding, who develops both the integrated attunement plus independent assessment and the genuine requirement for bilateral knowing, is a fundamentally different relational presence than the super empath who is still operating from the original template, not because the attunement changes, not because the capacity for depth changes, but because the direction in which the capacity is deployed changes, and the direction changes because the standard has been restored. The standard is this: the extraordinary sensitivity is available to connections in which it is met with genuine, consistent, developing reciprocity. It is not indefinitely available to connections in which the depth is perceived, but the reciprocity is perpetually potential rather than actually present. The patience that was previously organized around the hope of the reciprocity eventually emerging is now organized around the evidence of it actually emerging. The patience has a direction rather than simply a duration. This is not the closing of the heart. The heart that developed the super empath's capacity was opened through experience that was difficult, and the closing of it would be a greater loss than anything the avoidant dynamic produced. The closing is not the answer. The answer is the heart remaining open, with both eyes open alongside it. The full, genuine, extraordinary capacity for attunement, operating in the same interior as the clear, honest, independent assessment of what the attunement is encountering and what it actually deserves in return. The avoidant and the super empath keep finding each other because they are each for the other the most vivid available mirror. But a mirror only serves its function when the person looking into it is willing to see what is actually reflected rather than what they hoped to see. The super empath, looking honestly into the mirror the avoidant provides, sees the specific, developmentally rooted tendency to find depth in defended places and to extend toward it beyond the point where the evidence of genuine reciprocity supports continued extension. Sees the template, sees the cost of the template, and in seeing both clearly, gains the specific, genuine, usable self-knowledge that is the only foundation for a different pattern. The avoidant, looking honestly into the mirror the super impact provides, sees what genuine attunement feels like and what its loss costs, sees the specific, irreplaceable quality of being known by someone whose sensitivity reaches the defended places, sees, through the grief of the loss, the evidence of their own genuine need for exactly what the architecture keeps them from sustaining, and in seeing both clearly, gains the specific, genuine, usable motivation for the interior work that a different pattern requires. Neither mirror is comfortable. Both are necessary, and both are more available in the context of this specific dynamic than in any other relational configuration available to either person, which is, finally, the deepest answer to why super empaths always attract avoidance. Not because the universe is arranging instructive suffering, not because either person is broken in a complementary way, but because the specific, developmentally shaped interior architecture of each person produces the precise gravitational field that the other's specific, developmentally shaped interior architecture is most drawn to and most instructed by. The attraction is the curriculum. The pain is the pressure that makes the learning available. And the development for both people in their own ways, on their own timelines, through the specific interior work that the mirror keeps pointing toward, is the whole point, not the relationship as a destination. The becoming that the relationship makes necessary. That is what the pattern was always building toward, for both of them, all along.